This is the first part of a series of videos I've made on C-PTSD. I'll cover the introduction, where I explain the full picture of what this disorder represents, and then I'll follow with concrete steps on how a person can deal with it on their own. Without further ado, I present you the C-PTSD Compass, a guide to navigating and healing trauma. Hello, this is Nicola extending you a warm welcome and thanking you for investing your time in this CPTSD Compass. In the next hour, I'm going to be your guide to psychology and self healing. If you are here, it's likely because you feel stuck in a dysfunctional cycle. You're looking for clarity, healing, a better understanding of your emotional world, or maybe you want to better understand or help a loved one going through inner struggles. However, you haven't managed to find your proper tools, largely because CPTSD is almost totally neglected by professionals and gets diagnosed as some other similar disorder, all the while being uniquely distinct. In order for you to succeed, this video compass is designed to guide you through a structured, practical approach to understanding and recovering from trauma, especially complex post-traumatic stress disorder or CPTSD. Throughout this presentation, I'll walk you through 6 steps which I've compiled after a rough study of the work and research of notable psychologists, experts on CPTSD. But before we get into them one by one, it's essential that you hear the introduction so that you might form a clear picture in your mind of what this disorder represents. So, what exactly is complex PTSD? According to the World Health Organization's ICD-11 manual, CPTSD is a mental health condition that can develop after prolonged or repeated exposure to extremely threatening events, particularly those from which escape is difficult or impossible, such as childhood abuse, domestic violence, or captivity. It includes all the core symptoms of PTSD, such as flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, but adds 3 more distinct features: severe difficulties in emotional regulation, negative self perception or persistent beliefs of worthlessness, chronic interpersonal difficulties, especially in trust and intimacy. Now let's look at the difference between CPTSD and PTSD. While PTSD often results from a single traumatic event such as a car crash or a natural disaster, CPTSD comes from chronic trauma, usually over a long period and often beginning in childhood. The word complex is added because it's much more complicated to identify and treat, as well as to know where to look for the roots of it. And the critical fact of the matter is that even though it often develops in childhood, the impairment builds upon itself as the individual, even as an adult, gets more traumatized because of the feelings of inadequacy and incapability in their social life. Another key distinction is in relationship trauma. CPTSD often emerges when the trauma is caused by someone close, a caregiver, a partner, or someone trusted. That's why emotional and relational damage runs so deep. Dr. Judith Herman, who first proposed the concept of CPTSD in the 1990s, described it as trauma in the context of captivity, not necessarily physical captivity, but emotional entrapment. To set a clear boundary, let's look at the diagnostic criteria for both PTSD and CPTSD. For PTSD, exposure to a traumatic event involving an extremely threatening or horrific event or series of events. 3 core symptom clusters: re-experiencing the traumatic event or events in the present, for example, flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive memories. Avoidance of thoughts, memories, activities, or situations that remind one of the trauma. Persistent perceptions of heightened current threat, typically manifested as hypervigilance or exaggerated startle response. And duration. Symptoms must persist for several weeks and cause significant functional impairment. Now let's look at the criteria for CPTSD. For a person to be diagnosed with CPTSD, they need to meet the full criteria for PTSD listed above. Have 3 additional DSO symptom clusters: affective dysregulation, difficulty managing emotions, for example, outbursts, numbness, dissociation; negative self concept, persistent beliefs of worthlessness, failure, shame, or guilt; disturbed relationships, difficulties in sustaining relationships and feeling close to others. Symptoms must result from prolonged or repetitive trauma, often in situations where the person felt trapped, for example, childhood abuse, bullying, captivity, etc. And the disturbances cause clinically significant distress or functional impairment. Now let's look at conditions often confused with CPTSD. CPTSD can often be misdiagnosed as borderline personality disorder, depression, or generalized anxiety disorder. The emotional volatility, fear of abandonment, and unstable relationships seen in BPD, for example, can closely resemble the interpersonal challenges of CPTSD. In fact, the DSM-5 manual used in USA doesn't even include CPTSD as a distinct mental disorder. As a result, many cases get misdiagnosed with BPD and end up getting the wrong treatment and taking the wrong approach. Important difference to recognize is CPTSD is rooted in a trauma response, not a personality structure. Recognizing that distinction is critical for appropriate treatment. Despite there being an overlap in the persistent feelings of emptiness, a tendency towards substance abuse as a coping mechanism, maladaptive daydreaming, etc., CPTSD sufferers tend to overthink instead of being impulsive. And instead of fearing abandonment, they already feel chronically abandoned. Research by Marilyn Cloyter in 2014 showed that CPTSD and BPD are separate but overlapping conditions, with CPTSD showing higher levels of trauma related symptoms and less impulsivity than BPD. What causes CPTSD? The most common causes are childhood abuse, physical, emotional, or sexual, neglect or abandonment by caregivers, domestic violence or living in a war zone, human trafficking, forced labor, or long term captivity. However, since every trauma story is unique, there can be endless causes of CPTSD. So these are a few examples of less commonly recognized causes. Growing up in a visibly not dangerous, but emotionally unavailable household. Being bullied relentlessly over a period of time. Caring for a mentally ill or addicted parent without support. Spiritual or institutional abuse, etc. In essence, CPTSD develops when a person feels unsafe, unseen, or trapped over and over again. And once developed, that repeatability becomes almost a prophetic cycle of the individual manifesting those very feelings as a protective mechanism, being afraid of feeling worthy because whenever they felt worthy in the past, they had been disappointed and punished. As trauma researcher Dr. Basil van der Kolk explains, trauma isn't just what happens to you, it's what happens inside you as a result of what happened to you. What is trauma really? To understand CPTSD, we first need to understand trauma itself. Trauma isn't defined by the event alone, but by the impact it has on your nervous system. It's the lasting emotional, psychological, and physiological impact of an experience or experiences that overwhelm a person's ability to cope, leave them feeling helpless or unsafe, and alter how they see themselves and the world. It's the feeling that lingers long after the event or events, the wound left behind when something felt too much, too fast, or too long, and one had no way to protect oneself. One thing I want you to understand is that even if you've never been diagnosed with CPTSD, or if you don't think you meet the criteria I listed above, it doesn't mean that you have no right to complain. You don't need to be broken or meet every diagnostic criterion to benefit from a self understanding process. If you carry unresolved pain, patterns of emotional dysregulation, or relational fear, and it's costing you your peace, this compass is designed to guide you on how to address that. The other essential thing I want to stress is that you must forget self blame. As the above mentioned, trauma leaves physiological scars in the first place. Hence, even when you don't remember the concrete situation, at the slightest of triggers, your body reacts with the same chemical stimulants known as emotions as it did back at the traumatic event or events. The following physiological changes have been observed in trauma patients. First, the autonomic nervous system changes. Its sympathetic part gets overactivated, leaving one chronically stuck in a fight, flight, or freeze response, evident even in a dysregulated breathing and heart rate. This is because the parasympathetic part and its vagus nerve go into partial or severe shutdown and are unable to regulate this sympathetic response. As per Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory, trauma reduces the flexibility of the vagus nerve, which disrupts self-soothing and emotional regulation. Second, the brain rewires around survival. The amygdala, or fear center, becomes hyperactive, leading to heightened fear responses, emotional reactivity, and hypervigilance. The hippocampus, memory plus context center, gets impaired, blurring the lines between past and present, leading to flashbacks or intrusive memories. The prefrontal cortex loses essential capacity for rational thinking and focus, making emotional control harder. Third, HPA axis dysregulation. This is the stress hormone system. Results in excess cortisol production, which impairs immune functions, disrupts sleep, and increases risk of depression, anxiety, and inflammation. Over time, the HPA axis may even become exhausted, leading to blunted cortisol responses. And at this point, the system might stop responding properly to new stresses. In fact, trauma can even be stored physically, as the muscle memory can lead to unexplained pain or tightness, especially in the jaw or gut or shoulders and back. It can sometimes even lead to autoimmune or cardiovascular impairments or chronic fatigue. Alright, so this far I've only given you information but not any solution. However, this isn't just an educational project. What I'm going to give you next is a guided process grounded in the latest research and structures a step-by-step approach to understanding and healing from long-term trauma, especially complex trauma. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through how to identify trauma responses and triggers, concrete tools to regulate your emotional and nervous system, daily practices that promote healing and self-trust, and how to build resilience and a sense of empowerment, even after years of pain. You'll also hear references to leading trauma experts, including Dr. Judith Herman, who first defined CPTSD, Dr. Basil van der Kolk, author of The Body Keeps the Score, Dr. Stephen Porges, who developed polyvagal theory, Dr. Kristen Neff, whose research on self-compassion is central to healing, and many others whose work has shaped our understanding of trauma recovery. Healing from CPTSD doesn't require perfection, it requires structure, safety, and the willingness to take small steps, even when it's hard. That's what this video is here to support you in doing. So whether you have been formally diagnosed, suspect that past trauma is still impacting you, or simply want to understand yourself more deeply, you are in the right place. If you found this guide useful so far, I invite you to stick around for the rest of it.